I uploaded the wrong sample report. But the short version is that the state requires a standard report form of home inspectors. The key is, and when understanding the report form, that it really isn't a report form. You guys have standard documents that you use, promulgated by TAR, not TREC, right? The law geeks at TAR actually crank out the contract. Contract is not a TREC form.
We have TAR, TREC, and HAR forms.
Well, it's true because you have the disclosures and stuff like that, right? So you do have some TREC forms, but your contract is a fill in the blank. There's a lot of verbiage that you don't change, and then you have areas where you can put in stuff. Ours is a funny document. Everybody refers to it as a standardized form. It's really not. It's a standardized paragraph organization. Once you understand that, you'll understand why my example report is 18 pages long, and there are guys in Houston or in this marketplace that can't cross the street with less than 50 pages. How do we get that huge gulf? Because really, in the end, what you have to understand is the state of Texas requires an introduction. In this paragraph, this paragraph, introduction, is set by the state. It goes a page and a third. Please read it. It really recaps everything we just talked about, that it's not a complete, a foolproof inspection, that it's not warrantable. That one of the points lost on a lot of people, one of my favorite paragraphs in there is where it says, basically, if I find something, then it's on the buyer to do the research to find out what that costs to fix. And in doing so, when a repair guy comes out, he may find further depth, further items. Remember, I'm a generalist, so if a generalist finds something and an expert comes in to find out what the extent of that is, he may find out more errors. So you may have something that I say, you know, that could be $200, it could be $2,000, and he comes out and finds out that it's $200, $300, $3,000, because that's what experts do. Which is why it's important to have experts who you can trust, right, Kathy? So that we don't routinely find 3,000 every time. We only find 3,000 when there's really 3,000. But anyway, the state requires a standard introduction. Then there's an area where we will kind of put administrative data, who was present. But then here's the fun fact. Once you get into the inspection report, the state has the discussion at the top on what these blocks mean. Then it has paragraph organization. What's between foundation and grading and drainage is up to whoever writes the report form. There's a guy in town who has 18 pages where I have 3 inches of text. And that is what will be the bane of your existence for reading buyer's inspection reports. Because once we have marked inspected, not present, and deficient, or needs repair now, I'm sorry, deficient, put an X in the deficiency box and put something up underneath there, how easy is it to find that? How easy is it to separate the wheat from the chaff? Well, a lot of guys do what we do. Come down here to grading and drainage. See that red X? I'm not the only guy that does that. This is a Whisper Reporter. It's a fairly standard report format. There's also home gauge, inspect it. There are a number of reporting formats that all do the same thing. They put a red mark at the beginning of the issue so that you can focus right in on the issue. I like Whisper Reporter because the pictures are right underneath the issue. The old format that we used, all the pictures were at the end. So you had to read the report and then go and find the pictures. Now the pictures were labeled, but I like the picture to be with the item. It's easier to do. So this becomes very key in understanding what it is that's important and what's not important. Some indication, like I talked about earlier, that is that tells you what is needing to be dealt with and what is just fluff. If you go through our inspection report, you'll see, and this is not, like I said, this is Whisperer Reporter, probably a third of the inspectors in Houston use this software. It's the cheapest software in business. But when you realize, when you've been at it 10 years and you realize it really doesn't matter what computer software you use, it matters your skill set and experience in knowing what to put in the report. You stop buying. The older I get, the cheaper the software I end up buying is, because I had a $1,000 piece of software when I first started out. Total waste of money. This is $300 per person. But it organizes pictures with, and we get a little drawing on them. Most guys do something like that, but then, Kathy, you've got enough experience to answer this question about what percentage of guys have a summary at the end of the report.
I think most people do.
Most now? Yeah. See, it's fun. When I first started out, I was the first home inspector in this marketplace, this portion of Houston, to do things computerized, and just, man, everybody thought that was fantastic. Now everybody does it. And then I was one of the first guys to use digital cameras and insert that, and now everybody does that. And we had them create a summary page for us, and now everybody does that. But the summary page makes it a lot easier for you, because you can cut that summary page off 2 pages and highlight things and send them to repair guys. You don't have to send them the whole report. And that makes it a lot easier to get your bids done.
I like this and the whole thing though, because if you have the pictures, that helps a lot, pictures.
Yeah. Yeah, before we had digital cameras, it was a pain in the butt. We used to literally carry around cameras and send film to the developer, and this is back when we didn't have smartphones, ancient history 10 years ago.
You've always had one of the nicest reports.
Thanks.
Copy.
Yeah. And I apologize, I can send everybody a copy. If you'll give me your card, I'll send you a copy of the report so that you can go over it. But let's talk about what it is within the scope of those items that is key to understand. Starting with foundation. Now, a home inspector is always obligated to tell you what kind of foundation you have. And that seems pretty basic. But you'd be surprised how often people misidentify foundations. Not so much out here. Everything out here is a slab. But in town, people can't tell the difference between a pier and beam and a foundation. I know. But pier and beams are pretty unusual here. Since 1967, everything is rebar or post-tension cable foundation. And really before that, a lot of them were. But since FHA approved post-tension foundation is the best way to do houses in the Gulf Coast South in 1967, it's like pier and beam ceased to exist. So that's what most of your foundations are. The biggest problem we have with foundations is that we're not engineers. We're required by our license act to give an opinion about the condition of the foundation. That's one of those odd demand items. And the reason it's a demand item is for years home inspectors would say, I can't tell if the foundation's doing any good, I'm not an engineer. Well, Trek got tired of complaints from real estate agents and says we have to have an opinion. I don't mind that as long as you understand that my opinion comes with the caveat that I'm not an engineer. So there are things that we look at and look for that go to our ability to actually be able to give an educated opinion. But in the end, I'm not an engineer. So when I say that there's a problem, it's always, comma, get an engineer to come look at the house. And that's pretty rare, though. So understand in our environment. I'm sorry?
And what do you look for?
Thank you. The biggest indicator of foundation settlement around here is walls, movement of sheetrock and brick. Sheetrock is probably the best indicator because brick, depending on the style of brick and how it's installed, can give you some false positives. I live in Shenandoah at the front. Practically all of our houses are soft, what everybody calls cheap Mexican brick. It's neither cheap nor Mexican, but that's neither here nor there. But it's not fired brick. Because it's not fired, it's soft, it's easy to break. I have 5 step cracks in my house. There's nothing wrong with my foundation. That having been said, if I'm in Sterling Ridge looking at a fired brick house and it's got 5 step cracks coming down from a corner of a window to the foundation, I'm going to be a little more concerned because that house has those caulk joints in the walls, expansion joints. Those are there to control what happened to my house. They weren't around until the 80s. So when you have brick movement, and then we come inside and we see sheetrock movement, you couple those, and a smart home inspector is going to say it's time to bring in an engineer. Sheetrock is fairly pliable. As the wooden frame house flexes, and remember, we build wood frames for a reason. This is clay soil. We build a post-tension foundation on that because they flex nicely, subtly. Not so much do you ever see them, but they do flex a little bit. I tell people it's like the top to a box to a board game. If you pull off the top to a life game or whatever, Monopoly, and it flexes very predictably. Well, same thing goes on with your foundation, much more subtly. The wood frame standing on that, it flexes subtly, and so does your sheetrock. But if something goes screwy and it really starts staying there, that frame wasn't built for the slab to go concave or convex. So your walls will do that, and your sheetrock will only take so much force before it has to break. And it's going to break not at straight lines. As a house flexes, it's not unusual to see cracks at straight line corners where we would expect sheetrock to be seamed. Absolute corners, parallel with the ground, 4 feet up on the wall, kind of coming off a corner. That's a little unusual, but straight lines are generally your friends, angles are not. So we have kind of a crescent-shaped crack or a 33-degree angle going 2 feet off the corner of a dining room window, or the passageway between the dining room and the formal living room in a house in Oak Ridge North. Okay.
Are you seeing them in the Woodlands and the older homes in Brogan's Mill?
It happens occasionally. I consider myself lucky to work this marketplace because not only are we busy, but I always feel like the construction in the Woodlands as a master plan community with a developer that was concerned about quality is better, even in the older neighborhoods up front where maybe they hadn't really gotten all their duckies in a row at the Woodlands Corporation yet. I still think those houses are better built than the houses of similar age in Spring, along Cypress Wood and all those kinds of places. So I don't see a lot of settlement in the Woodlands. Do I find it occasionally? Yeah, and it's almost always up front. Yeah, the older homes. But it's relatively uncommon. It's far less common than people think it is to have foundation settlement, pretty much anywhere. There are some predictable neighborhoods. There's 2 off Aldine Westfield that every time I go in there, I swear 50% of the houses I find in there have foundation problems.
Is that a soil issue or a construction issue?
Sometimes soil, but generally it's construction. There's a neighborhood near the airport in Conroe where the builder famously got his, and this is in the city of Conroe, the builder got his pass on the pre-pour. After the city inspector would leave, he would take half that steel out and put it in another building. And all the foundations that were built up to about 75 have all had to be repaired. And that, the guy shut his company down and moved to Nicaragua or something. So, I mean, there are just dirtbags in every industry. So, Aldine Westfield, there's so many different builders in those 2 neighborhoods, I think it's a soils issue. Plus, it's close to a creek bed. And one of the common problems, without getting too much into the nuts and bolts of foundations here, is how you build a foundation really comes down to what's called soil plasticity. As it sounds, it's really got to do with the flexibility of soil. Really, in a perfect world, and you ask any of the good custom builders and they do this, you have to do a bore test down to 100 feet, at least 50, but preferably down to 100 feet, of what is the soil plasticity at the site that the foundation is going in of every house you build. I can guarantee you there's not a production builder in the Woodlands, much less in Houston, that does every site. They'll do 2 sites in 50 lots. I can guarantee you that Paul Meyer does 2 sites on every stinking house. I'm pretty sure that everybody else at that grade of house does too. Last time I asked a custom builder in the Woodlands, 8,000 square foot house, he'd done 3. So once you understand the plasticity, you can engineer the foundation correctly and you don't get movement. So as fast and loose as some builders take their risk with soil plasticity, it's amazing we don't have more problems. But really, I don't see, inside 40 years, you don't see a lot of problems, 40 or 50 years.
And is it true if a house has had foundation issues and has been repaired, that it's better than,
If I were,
would you be leery to purchase a house that has had foundation?
not because of the foundation. If I had to choose between two houses to buy for my family and one of them had repair and one of them hadn't, I'd buy the one that had been repaired. That's stronger than the one that had never been. So there's nothing wrong with the house having a history. Now, if we have a history of the foundation repair company having been out 3 times, and there's other things, that's why you got to get the right company to do it the first time, get a lifetime warranty, and be done with it.
Is it true too with the doors, if the doors are just won't stay in the right? In the same
Floating
place,
doors.
Floating doors, is that
Yeah.
another indicator?
That's kind of overdiagnosed. Floating doors and tight windows you'll hear overdiagnosed. In fact, there's a commercial with a famous ex-baseball player saying, do you have tight doors? You may have foundation repair, or you may have foundation failure. What people never hear is may. I do new construction. So I'm here to tell you, I have watched a guy in about a 2,400 square foot house hang every door inside the house, 2 guys, in an hour and a half. The guy who was doing the exterior doors, front and back door, now it's 2 separate contractors for the builder, 2 subcontractors, was there when the interior door guy got there, was still there when the interior door guy left. He was just still hanging 1 door. He spent 4 hours hanging 2 doors. And the guys who hung the interior doors, and I counted them, and there were 17 doors, counting closets and pantry and everything else, hung in an hour and a half. What do you get? You get a door that might be plumb, might not be plumb. So you got to take doors that move themselves with a grain of salt. Plus, in an older house like mine, you take the doors off, you paint, you put them back. Do you get the right door in the right place with the right hardware in the right place, or do you turn a hinge slightly? And that causes a door to float. So there's other reasons doors can float. Windows are not always installed square. The opening for the window is not always installed square. One of the few things that's installed dead square, or I'm sorry, manufactured dead square, is a window. The window is square, but the hole may not be. So a little flexing of that wood over 10 or 15 or 20 years can cause a window to be tight, and it's got nothing to do with anything other than the slight normal construction flexing of a window hole that's a little off. It's not square. So you got to be careful. I'm a bigger fan of sheetrock and brick indicators than personally, based on my experience. And I'm not an engineer, but after 10,000 houses, I don't really worry a lot about floating doors, unless there's 4.
4?
Yeah, well, 3 or 4. 3 or 4. You know, you start building up indicators, and at a certain point, it's what I call a gray call. It's not black, it's not white. There's no angular sheetrock cracking. But I've got 2 tight windows in the same room, the closet and the door to the hall, and the adjacent bathroom, and the hall across, the bedroom across the hall all float. And they all float the same direction. Even though 2 doors face each other, therefore the hinges are going to be opposite. One floats closed, the other one floats open, so they're both floating that way. So you start piling indicators. Once again, experience. You gotta. This is, more than anything else, the time that it helps to have a home inspector with enough experience to string facts together to come to a logical conclusion. Okay. Grading and drainage. Roof-related areas. Everybody wants to know about how old the roof is, how long it's going to last. And like I indicated earlier with my war story, that's tough. A 30-year roof here in the Woodlands, can go 20, 22 years, especially if you have a ton of shade. You take that same house by that same builder, plop it down in Katy where there's, what, 4 trees in the whole city? 15 years, maybe 17 years. Same roof, same manufacturer, same shingle, same subcontractor. It's all about ultraviolet light and weather. That's what really kills roofs. So we try to ballpark, give people an understanding of what the life expectancy is, but I always end with the same discussion point. Because of the weather, though, all bets are off. I have recommended a new roof on a 9-month-old house on Lake Conroe after a hurricane, well, tropical storm. Builder was PO'd. I'm sorry, the roof was 9 months old. The house was just being sold by the builder. He was quite PO'd, but just because you just roofed it doesn't mean a tropical storm cares. It is what it is. I'm going through the inspection report, make sure I cover a few high points, because this slide I cover a bunch of stuff that's not on there. Attic framing is a good time to discuss age-related issues also. You have a lot of houses here in the front that were built before 1990. And then you have the houses in the back that are newer than that, obviously. Well, in 1990, there was a huge framing code change. So you look at my house. My house was built for wood shingle roof, which is lighter. Therefore, there's less framing. And then you go into the neighborhoods where it was built for composition shingle, you'll see slightly more framing. But then since 1990, you'll see a lot more framing. That's because there was a code change in 1990. Now, you sell a house built in 1980 in the front, is that person obligated to bring that framing up to code? And this is one of those times you're going to see a write-up from home inspectors that get caught up in the code. My house does not meet framing code. My house has been there since 1973, so it's probably survived half a dozen hurricanes and tropical storms. It's clearly not collapsed yet. This is one of those times where you will see comments from one home inspector where he'll say, this needs to be done and that needs to be added and this other thing needs to be done. And then you call me and I say, it's a 1985 house or a 1973 house built for shingles, even lighter. The seller is not obligated to fix that. You want the new house, go out to Wood Forest and buy the new house and spend the other $100,000. You buy a 1973 house, you get a 1973 house. Unless there's really signs of failure. And that's the difference. Once again, that's my opinion. I can introduce you to 2 or 3 home inspectors who will say, this house is going to collapse during the next hurricane. Now, was anybody here for the last hurricane? Did anybody hear about a house collapsing? But they'll say it. The other thing that comes up a lot during attic framing is we're more keyed towards insulation issues. My house was re-insulated just before I bought it, so it's not a big issue in mine, but a lot of houses in my neighborhood, it's this deep now, and you're bleeding energy through your roof like there's no tomorrow. So we can't in good conscience not tell a home buyer in that neighborhood, you may want to consider adding some insulation. Nothing on the seller's fault. Once again, you want a 1980 house, you get a 1980 house. And that means that insulation has collapsed. Talked about that. Okay. Electrical, one of the biggest issues is ground fault circuit interrupters and arc fault circuit interrupters. Now, ground fault circuit interrupters have been around, and I'm sorry, we already talked about AC, so we are not testing air conditioners when it's below 60. Big deal. But ground fault circuit interrupters as a demand item have been around since the 80s. Between 1981 and 1985, those outlets with the buttons in between the 2 positions, GFCIs, were added first in bathrooms, then on the exterior, which includes the garage, then in the kitchen, and then in 1996, we went from the old rule, which is only the outlets within 6 feet of the kitchen sink, to all outlets serving the counter regardless of their location. So basically, any open use outlet on the exterior, in the garage, in a bathroom, or anywhere in a kitchen counter has to be GFI protected. Now, if you read down the code book, you'll also see things like on a wet bar within 6 feet, on a laundry sink within 6 feet. So there is still a 6-foot rule, but it doesn't apply in most houses. You don't see a lot of wet bars, and you got to get a certain size before people have laundry room sinks. But there's a lot of confusion between GFCIs and AFCIs because my License Act requires, if you don't have GFIs to current code, I'm required to recommend that you repair that. And that's a great example of one of the things that I do think it's legitimate for a buyer, particularly one with small kids, to ask a seller to retrofit or compensate, because that is, a GFI will save you from death. It's absolutely a worthwhile thing to repair. Now, arc fault circuit interrupters, AFCIs, are new. They weren't required in code till 2004. What an arc fault circuit interrupter is, to separate it from a ground fault circuit interrupter, GFCI is installed in outlets, and it protects you when electricity gets in contact with water and grounds out, because if you're in that chain, if you're the one touching the plug and something in the sink, it only takes a 1/4 amp to stop your heart. So if you're grounding out to the sink, it can kill you. So the GFCI trips when a 1/4 amp comes off the circuit, shuts the circuit down to keep it from hurting you. And we all carry testers. It's very easy to figure out if a GFCI is working. Arc fault circuit interrupters, after 2004, that's a new device. It measures the power going through the circuit loop, and when there's an arc, which is any time a hot and a neutral wire get close enough to nearly touch, and that little spark that jumps from wire to wire, that's an arc. And a spark can start a fire. So the classic fear, the reason that they changed this code, is carpet or drapes being caught on fire by an arcing, damaged power cord. Now, in 2004, new construction homes had to have arc faults in all bedroom circuits. After 2008, arc faults, once again in new construction, have to be in all outlet circuits in the house that aren't GFI. So now living room, dining room, study, bedroom, everything. It's either every outlet circuit either has an arc fault in the electric panel because it's a general use circuit in a dry space, or has GFIs located downstream because it's in a wet space, exterior garage, bath, kitchen. So now every outlet circuit is. Well, what about a house built in 2000 that is being sold, and the home inspector says retrofit the arc faults? I disagree. There's nothing in our License Act that says anything other than I have to educate the buyer on what an arc fault is and give them options.
Is the retrofit expensive on either of them?
No on GFIs. An individual GFI at Home Depot is $12. You can change with a pair of pliers and a screwdriver if you're handy. By and large, handymen charge $25 to $50 each. Electricians about $75 each to change GFIs. Not expensive. Arc faults are breakers in the electric panel. So you have to change the breaker. So the first question is there enough room? Because the breakers are a little larger. Generally, yes. But with a house built before 1980, generally no. Then you get into the problem of capacity on the line. I'm not an electrician. I don't play one on TV, but the reasons why the retrofit doesn't work well that I've heard from electricians are, if you look at most new homes, the outlet circuits are 20 amp circuits, and arc faults don't work real well on your bedroom circuit if it's a 15 amp circuit. Modern circuits have fewer outlets on them. Older circuits would have more, and if you plug in a vacuum cleaner and there's 10 outlets on it instead of 6, it's going to kick the arc fault. So for one reason or another, I have never personally met an electrician who believed in retrofitting arc faults.
They don't want to do it.
No, they're always afraid to call. In fact, I've actually had builders refuse, small custom builders, tell me, I'm not putting arc faults in because you're going to ask me to come back and take them out. Now, I always say the same thing. I'm not, a 20 amp circuit on modern construction, I've never heard of arc faults being a problem. but I have personally met handymen who have retrofit a house, and then they plug in an elliptical glider, particularly high-end vacuum cleaner or treadmill. It's always kicking the circuit out. And mama calls them and says, come take your damn arc fault and go away.
Is that what's happening? Because I've sold a couple of new homes, I won't say the builder, and I've had two of the buyers saying that their outlets keep tripping. And they'll plug in a coffee pot and a vacuum cleaner or something, or more than a couple things, and then it goes.
It's frustrating every time I plug my vacuum in.
Is it the arcs?
And
I-
I do house.
Yeah, I've heard of arc faults being bad, and then too many outlets on the circuit can cause an arc fault a problem. Once again, you talk to different electricians. It's a newish device, so all of the square D arc faults that first were installed all had to be recalled because they were all bad internally too. So is it a bad arc fault? Is it a bad install? Too many? There's several reasons why an arc fault can go bad. So yes, with all the stories we hear on new construction, why would you retrofit a house? So there's a great example of something I have to tell your client, and then I say, I would not do
You just gave me an aha moment because my house is 2 years old and, and my builder's warranty hadn't come out because I could plug my vacuum in and, it was
Yeah.
a low breaker every time. It's so frustrating. What's the next thing?
every time. Sure.
It's probably that that's doing it.
Mm-hmm. It's either a bad arc fault, or there's too many outlets on the circuit, or it's a 15 amp circuit instead of a 20.
I think it was a bad arc fault, so they came in and did something in my breaker box and changed it out.
The other thing about arc faults is you'll see about half your electricians will space an arc fault with a non-arc fault outlet, because if you stack 4 arc faults, they're bigger, they warm up, and they burn each other out in an electric panel. So you find electricians who will space them, which causes a labeling coordination issue. It just is frustrating for them. I did a house yesterday, had 16 arc faults. I'm sorry, Saturday had 16 arc faults. And there was not enough room in the electric panel to space them all out. So I had explained to her to be a little watchful of it. New construction on East Shore. Okay, we talked about that. And I apologize. I am using a shorter version of this slide presentation. So I have a group of 8 slides I took out for this presentation that actually give bullet points for each area, which I can send you a copy of. But I'm just, from memory, I'm covering the high points. Float switches on air conditioners. Getting back to the AC, 60 degrees when we do run it. Float switch, I probably need to start putting the pictures in some of these things. There's a bobber switch that goes in the drain pan under your air conditioner up in the attic. It's called a float switch. It serves the purpose of shutting down your air conditioner when that drain pan fills up. Because an air conditioner is a dehumidifier. Every time it runs, about 10 minutes after it starts running, it will really get in the mode and it will start really pulling moisture out of your interior of your house. That's how your house is dehumidified. It has a drain line connected to the evaporator that goes into the wall, and in a new house it comes out under a sink and plugs into a P-trap, but you never hear it, and unless you bend over and look really in the back of the under sink area, you never see it. That's where an AC is supposed to drain every day. 15 gallons on a good day is not unusual. Okay? What if that system becomes backed up or overwhelmed? There's a catch pan underneath it that the evaporate goes into, and then drips out a line up high on your eave outside. We've all seen that line outside. If anything ever comes out of it, something's wrong with the air conditioner, have it serviced immediately. Since 2010 in Montgomery County, by code, you have to have a float switch in that drain pan on all new installs. What a float switch does is if the drain pan backs up, starts to overflow, the float switch will float and shut the AC down rather than let it collapse sheetrock and make a huge mess. I've seen overflow drain pans cost $5,000 worth of damage. It is not in any code book anywhere that you have to have a float switch. But the city of Conroe passed a code requiring float switches on all new installs since 2010. So that makes it code in the entire county. What? There's a state law that says if you're building in an unincorporated area, you have to follow the code of the largest city in your county that has an enforced code. So for Montgomery County, that's Conroe. Anywhere in Harris County, that's Houston. Float switches are not common south of the creek or in Creekside. North of the creek, in the rest of the Woodlands, and anywhere in the county, you get a new install, you get a float switch. And that is a very common screw-up on new construction.
That they don't install it?
They don't install a float switch because they didn't notice they went north of the creek.
Okay.
You find a big subcontractor that works out of Houston and is following one of the townhouse builder. This is what the guy who's Pelican Homes builds in East Shore. The townhouse. Really, I think he's a good builder, but he's from downtown, and his subs are all from in the city, and it's not a code down there. Every time I do a Pelican, and I did one Saturday, there's no float switches, and I have to write them up on float switches, and I always very politely explain to them about that law.
So if you do an inspection in Houston,
And there's no float switch on a new construction.
not write that up? So you
I do it as a suggestion. It goes from a blue, for those of you that, when you get the copy of my report, you'll see a blue check mark. That's a suggestion. This is a very good idea. You should consider it. There's a red X. This needs to be done.
You really have to know your area and the codes for each
Yeah.
area.
Which is why you won't find me south of Houston, because I suck at wind hazard.
Right, they have a whole.
All that beach stuff, I know that you have to have 6 nails in a shingle instead of 4. But that's about all I know about south of I-10. Yeah, windstorm stuff. But that's a good example of the kind of stuff that you find that is relatively obscure that a home inspector has to know. Let's talk real quick about aluminum wire. You don't find much of it here, but if you guys sell in Timber Ridge, Timber Lakes for any reason, or we put a lease in there, that entire neighborhood is aluminum wire, aluminum distribution wire. The key is to understand the difference between service wire